Well, welcome everybody. My name is Elena Campbell. I'm an Associate Director at the Centre for Innovative Justice at RMIT University, and it's my very great privilege to be facilitating this panel discussion for you today. It's part of Law Week. As you know, there are lots of fantastic events being held right across this week, both online and in person. But for this panel, it's particularly important to be able to highlight and explore even a little bit this really complex and challenging issue related to adolescent violence in the home. We have a fantastic panel for you today, but before I introduce them, I of course want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands from which we all join this meeting. For me, I'm very privileged to join you from Boonwurrung country, bordering on Kurnai country. It's a beautiful part of Victoria. But wherever we join from, I acknowledge that this land sovereignty was never ceded, and this land will always was and always will be Aboriginal land. It's particularly important to recognise this in the context of the 30-year anniversary of the Royal Commission into Deaths in Custody approaching, and the very, very distressing rates of incarceration for young Aboriginal people that we're still seeing occur today. That's something that we want to acknowledge as a backdrop to our discussion as we move forward. Now, what I'll do just in terms of, before I introduce the panel, I want to let you know a bit of housekeeping details. As you know, this session is being recorded, so if for people who aren't able to make it to the discussion today, that we'll distribute the link and it will be able to be forwarded on to anyone you think may enjoy it or benefit from hearing what the panel has to say. There is a chat function which we will be able to see if you would like to feed through any questions as you go, and we will be monitoring that and try and either address your questions or the focus of your questions at least as we go throughout the discussion, but there is time at the end for any of the issues that we haven't been able to address as we go. Now, it's a very, very complicated topic that we're trying to address in an hour today, so we won't be able to cover all of the components, but I'm really, really delighted and grateful to Youthlaw for bringing together this panel. Youthlaw is a fantastic partner of ours who we are co-located with, but also do a lot of work with around this issue. And they've brought together a panel including Gemma Mead from Drummond Street, Stephanie Pachias from Youthlaw itself, Dharma Anderson from VicPol, is a family violence training officer and has worked in all sorts of aspects of family violence over the years, and Danny Gold from the Royal Children's Hospital, who we've really privileged to have here because we think it's a particularly important issue to highlight, that the relationship with health and mental health, and the topic that we're going to discuss today. But before we do that, I'm just going to give you a bit of a background because we've got a really diverse audience coming to us from policy backgrounds, practice backgrounds, legal and community service and otherwise. And we're still coming to grips with what this issue of adolescent violence in the home, or AVITH, as we use the acronym that we use to describe it, is. It's also termed adolescent family violence, but we're still coming to grips with what this actually means and looks like, let alone how we respond as a service and a legal system. So increasingly, the use of family violence or violence in the home by young people has been recognised as a real challenge. It's something that has grown in recognition in Victoria since in 2008, we expanded our legislative definition of family violence to capture wider use of family violence in the context of different family relationships. So since that time, a fairly consistent number, around 10% of police family violence call-outs have involved adolescents or young people as respondents, and a similarly consistent number of intervention order matters similarly involve young people as respondents. And certainly that consistent number was relied upon by the Royal Commission into Family Violence all those 5 years ago, when it dedicated a chapter specifically to adolescent family violence, and possibly for the first time really recognised it as part of family violence policy. And one of the important things that the Royal Commission did was articulate that it was an issue that really needed to have a considered focus. It articulated that young people were particularly vulnerable and that this was a particularly hidden issue, including for families experiencing it, who often suffer in silence and stigma because they feel that it is a real reflection on them as a family, and they worry for the consequences of their child. And the Royal Commission made a number of recommendations which were designed to help improve the response to adolescent violence in the home. Now, since that time, a certain number of those recommendations have been implemented. The recommendations themselves, in the short time that the Royal Commission had, recommendations weren't necessarily articulating a systematic or response. It was about improving certain elements of our service and legal response. And one of the things was one of the recommendations included expanding AVIS-specific programs, which had been available at that point in a certain number of locations in Victoria, and the recommendation was that those be expanded statewide. The recommendations were that crisis accommodation be made available for children and young people using violence, but that be linked to therapeutic interventions. The recommendation that was that a statewide diversion program be established at a legislative level, and then various other recommendations related to the response available at the Children's Court, response available within Victoria Police, and that programs specifically addressing adolescent violence be able to be linked to a restorative response as well. And what we've had from government in those past 5 years, the ensuing long 5 years, it's incredible to think that it's been 5 years since that time, has been a little bit stop-start. We've certainly recognised that, or we're all aware in this sector, that those recommendations have not been implemented in full, and only recently the implementation monitor, in handing down her report, again allocated a specific chapter to adolescent violence in the home in recognition that there was still a lot of work to be done. But what we know for those of us who work in and around it or who research in this area, as do I, that those recommendations are actually just the tip of the iceberg in trying to understand the complexity of this challenge, and also trying to understand what our service and legal response currently is and what it should be if we were to come together and develop a more considered and systematic response. One of the reasons I'm here is that I led a research project for ANROS, which ran over 3 years and which looked specifically at the legal response to AVIS across three different Australian jurisdictions with quite different legislative settings. And those legislative settings affected the extent to which this issue was visible or recognised at all. But particularly the thing to understand as we go into this discussion, in that in the Victorian context, because this issue has been recognised at legislation for the last 12 or 13 years, what that means is that children or young people essentially receive the same legal response to family violence as is designed to respond to adult intimate partner violence. And that is not something that is necessarily nuanced or is able to respond to the wide diversity of complex scenarios which the legal system, and particularly police and courts, encounter when they attend an incident. And it's certainly not something that we're able to respond to with one particular type of service. And I've just noticed somebody asking for a link to our research in the chat yet, which I will definitely publish when I've stopped talking, because I'm not that great at multitasking. But certainly one of the things that we found in our research is that the current system response that we have is a very blunt one, and that in many ways it may be doing more harm than good. That's because it essentially puts children and young people as respondents to an intervention order at risk of criminalisation. That means that their parents, who may have been seeking the justice system support just for safety, are incredibly concerned about the implications for their children in terms of criminalising them. So it tends to can deter families from seeking further assistance rather than bringing them forward for support. And that in turn has impacts on the extent to which we can recognise or understand the scale of the problem. Because where families are not reporting because of fear of consequences for their children, including their adolescent who may be using violence, or their younger children because of mandatory reporting considerations and child protection involvement, that means we're driving the issue further underground. And obviously that's not something that is going to be helping with the stigma and isolation that families experience. And one of the things that we understand in terms of the traditional or conventional conception of adolescent violence in the home is that generally one of the biggest risk factors or contributing factors in this issue is that kids have themselves experienced family violence. And they may well be essentially replaying learned behaviour where parents may well be separated now, but once a child reaches a certain age, that's something they start to use that behaviour because they've learnt that that's how things are done. But what we've come to understand in a lot more detail more recently is that itself is just one aspect. We know that experience of trauma in childhood can impact children's ways of regulating their behaviour, their emotions, their language development, their mental health, their self-soothing behaviours through AOD, their capacity to cope with school. So one of the things that we heard consistently throughout our research across all 3 jurisdictions, regardless of what the legal response was that if we are responding to AVIS, we're responding 10 years too late, because we really needed to get support in for those families much, much earlier, either for parents who are trying to recover from their own experiences of trauma and for children who we know and the Royal Commission recognised as invisible or silent victims of family violence. And that's one of the things that the Implementation Reform Monitor highlighted, the Commissioner for Children and Young People has been trying to highlight, that we really haven't grappled with what our focus should be in terms of recognising kids' needs in terms of their experience of family violence in their own right. So it's with that in mind, that we're going to try and explore some of the challenges, not all, just some, and some of the opportunities in this area today. So bearing in mind, we're going to start possibly at an earlier point, at what we like to think might be an earlier point before justice system intervention kind of comes into play. And I'm going to throw to Gemma Mead at Drummond Street, who is involved with the service with working with families and young people generally before they come into contact with the justice system, at least for AVIS. So Gemma, could you tell us about what your service aims to do and the kinds of needs and challenges you see?
Absolutely. Thanks, Elena. So at Drummond Street Services, over probably the last 10 or 15 years, we've been delivering the Family Mental Health Support Service, which is for families 0 to 18 where mental health issues are emerging for children and young people. And often there's also other complex needs and mental health issues being experienced by parents and caregivers. That's across the northwest metro area of Melbourne. And through that work, we now have 50 to 60% of the families who have experienced family violence or currently experiencing family violence as well. And over the last few years, really seeing the young people and young people from 8 up to 18 who are starting to display aggressive or harmful behaviour within the home. And then Elena did the amazing Pippa project, which I've seen the links being put into the chat now. So do take the time, if you haven't, to read that research. Really built on the kinds of themes and issues that we were seeing in the work that we were doing with families. And our program really is meant to be, I guess, more in that early intervention space. What we really came to understand through the work that we were doing, that just addressing the young person as the issue wasn't going to work. We often had families or parents who were at their wits' end bringing kids to us saying, please fix this kid, you know, they're causing harm within the home, towards siblings, towards myself or us as parents and caregivers. And the approach that we've taken, we have some funding now, which is great, through the federal government for a 2 to 3 year project, is really looking at how to take that whole of family approach to this issue. So really working with the family to do an intensive intake and assessment process where we work with every individual within that family to look at what's going on for them. Someone's just posted, it's Drummond Street Services. So we're a community service organisation based across the northwest metro, Melbourne. And we do that intake process. Sometimes it might just be a parent that wants to actually engage in the service, and that's fine. Sometimes it is the young person, sometimes it's the whole family, including siblings. Once we've really unpacked the dynamics and what's going on in the family, and recognising that there are multiple other layers that impact on the way in which these behaviours appear and how they impact on the different individuals around people's cultural background, their faith, disability. Often, as Elena said, pretty much all of the situations that all families we're working with, there has been a historical family violence. Sometimes that original perpetrator is still living in the home, or if they have left, those impacts are still being felt and they may still be having some contact with the young people. So really understanding the full context of those family relationships, and then working on safety and plans for each individual, but also a whole of family plan as to what are the kind of issues that we can address and the work that we can do within that family. And we have a number of practitioners that will work with the family. So we may have a worker for the young person, one for the parent caregiver, one for siblings. Often some of these young people might also be living with grandparents. If there's some respite happening for the family, we can work with, you know, various different formations of family. We also run queer space here, so work with a range of different families and families of choice, families of origin. And as Elena said, it's incredibly complex in terms of sometimes with our families, there is a legal response involved. Courts have been involved. We've got referrals from them, but often we are getting referrals before it gets to that point. And those parents are often quite concerned about even speaking about the issue, because they are worried what will be the consequences for the young person, the child within the family, and how can they kind of protect them from that, but also still continue to protect their own safety and the siblings' safety, and wanting to. We do a lot of work on parenting as well. We have a parenting specialist who's part of the team, which has been fabulous to look at the different ways in which different parenting styles and can impact on the behaviour. I think another really important issue is that often these young people come to us with a diagnosis of oppositional disorders or on the spectrum, and we really try to unpack that and look at how much of that is actually a trauma response and trauma behaviour, and how much is there actually a diagnosis or a disability at play within that family as well. So incredibly complex. That's the way in which we work. We're finding that taking that whole family approach and also drawing in and working with other services, whether there's AOD issues or homelessness. And I think the respite issue is a huge one that we have. It would be just fantastic to be able to have a safe space where people could have a bit of time out from one another, so we can do some more of that therapeutic work. And sometimes family reunification is the goal. Sometimes that's not going to be the safest option.
Yeah. And thanks, Gemma. That's respite option is something, you know, it was certainly why one of the reasons that the Royal Commission made recommendations for a specific respite or crisis accommodation intervention that was available to address this issue, and it's just not something that's been fully appreciated perhaps, and it's something that we'd like to keep pushing. But now, Danny, could you, something that's not perhaps widely appreciated, although that Gemma's certainly highlighted the extent to which a range of different diagnoses or suspected diagnoses are often present in kids experiencing it, this issue, and families experiencing this issue, is that families will often present to the mental health system for some kind of response in absence of any other support. Can you tell us a bit about what that looks like, and what on any one day some of the cases that you and your clinicians need to respond to?
Absolutely, thanks. So adolescent violence in the home is a common reason for consultation with myself as a specialist family violence advisor, and it's a common issue for presentation across different parts of the acute and case management service. Often by the time I'm consulted, the behaviour is fairly long-standing and it's escalating in frequency or severity. Very, very rarely have family members either identified that this is family violence, or indeed that there is resources outside of the mental health system that they're comfortable to use, such as the police, to support a response. Children as young as 7 are being referred to us with extreme violent behaviours towards family members. They've often got several parts of the service system involved, and really both the family and the service system are operating in a perpetual cycle of crisis and response rather than any long-term planning or support. The way that violence is often showing up in the mental health service is that it presents alongside a range of neurodevelopmental issues and mental health conditions or issues. Young people are often referred for us to assess or diagnose the condition as a way to explain the violence. And I think inherently we can get lost in a cycle of assessment and diagnosis rather than looking at environmental impacts and realities, and who we need to consider as part of that assessment. There can be a real tension between exploring and understanding the illness and the behaviours, and how we can respond to both of those in tandem. And in so doing, the inquiry and consideration of family safety can be missed. During COVID, we can now state quite clearly the sort of presentations that disproportionately increased, particularly through the ED, which were presentations, particularly young females, around anxiety, suicidal ideation, eating disorders, and extreme aggression. I think that one of the positives is that those presentations have actually increased awareness around AVIF in the health setting, and there's beginning to be a language around it. Sometimes these young people are brought in by police or ambulance. And in the context of what's best in terms of the mental health presentation, there can be an inherent tension around whether we admit or whether we discharge. And that is a really tricky place where what's really highlighted is that safety planning for mental health support is very different to safety planning for family safety. And I don't think that clinicians in that pressure situation of an acute care scenario are particularly skilled to have the language around family safety to explore that. Given the bed availability crisis that's going on, it also means that parents are often the point of discharge. Really often, it's single mothers who are the target of the abuse, and are also the target of the safe discharge context. So we are asking parents to agree that they feel safe enough to return home with the child that has recently caused significant damage or fear to themselves and other members of the family. One other thing I will say in regards to where our client groups sit alongside interaction with the legal system is that I don't think a lot of our particularly younger cohort of adolescent patients presenting with adolescent violence are not known to be involved with the criminal justice system, and rarely have they had IVOs or police attention in a formal way. They'll have fairly traumatic experiences when they're called out to an incident. But I believe that both the hospital staff and the parents are seeking other ways to get that help rather than ever calling the police. So there's not a safe relationship that exists either in a practitioner's mind or a family's mind around how to come together. And really the most common point of contact with the legal systems, as has been mentioned, is a child protection experience that has not necessarily felt largely supportive. And the other real issue for us is the family court systems, which have caused so much trauma that young people are often still going backwards and forwards between someone who has perpetrated violence towards them, and in that context are often coming back with significantly increased behavioural disturbances. On many occasions, they're actually acting very violently at the mention of having to go to that other parent's house, and we are struggling to listen to that. So we as practitioners are then also being subjected to the abuse, and that's often when it comes actually to attention, is when the abuse moves beyond the parent. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Danny. It just is a glimpse of how many complicated factors are involved, and certainly the presence of family law issues and an adult perpetrator slightly out of view on the sidelines was a significant theme that came throughout PIPA research, and it's something that is an example of how sometimes we assume that our family violence system has solved the issue because they've stepped in and separated the parents, when in fact it's just the beginning of another journey of even more significant abuse or systems manipulation. Dharma, we've just had a question about the response for either police or hospital, and has a particular angle in terms of increased attendance at ED by young women, a gendered behaviour to the approach to the behaviours. I'll ask the panellists to have a little think about that when we come back to this. But Dharma, can you tell us about what kind of considerations police have to bring to bear when they are called to an incident involving a young person using family violence? What are the obligations on police to consider, and what are the challenges and barriers that you have to juggle?
So fundamentally, I think Victoria Police has been on a reform journey around response to family violence for a great many years, and part of that reform journey is informed by research and evidence base, but also the things that we pick up in practice. So there's an amount of work that's been done over time about, well, who are the people coming to the door in a family violence context, and what's the general outcomes. So one of the things that we know about is that if we check on our engagement with young offenders using violence in community settings, some of that violence is very, very high. And when we track back, we understand that their context of early childhood is exactly the context that Gemma and Danny were describing. There's a multiple load of other factors which have gotten in the way of their general development. So as a result of that and for PIPA research, we've kind of reformed our approach to consider that adolescent use of violence in the home is actually a child safety issue. And it's a child safety issue not just for the siblings, but for the young person involved as well. We have a point of intervention where we can help to reframe that behaviour so that before they actually transition to adulthood, they maybe have an intervention that has a few more life skills involved and can help them to manage those complex emotional situations better, and they don't become an adult offender with a trajectory into justice systems later on. So that's the aim and the intent, and that's where we're attempting to shift and reform our interventions. But what we come up against is the systems and structures that we're working within. And in the Children, Youth and Families Act, we are protective interveners in terms of children at risk. So where there is significant violence in the home and there are younger siblings, to a certain extent, they become our primary client. They are children at risk. and there needs to be a way of managing that risk. So we engage with child protection. There may be, in a general sense, removal of that young person from the home then becomes the solution. So we have systems and processes which guide us to be quite binary and problem approached, whereas it would be useful if we can transition to a place where we actually understand the polarity of these complex situations and can work on more nuanced or care team approaches. But we're still working through that system. So there tends to be all of those barriers that the Danny and Gemma were referencing about people coming forward, the reluctance of criminalising children, even just conceiving that if I go to police, that's actually an indicator that I haven't been able to parent. I haven't been able to get this right myself. There are so many barriers to getting to us that on balance, the situation is quite out of control by the time it does. So we've got 12-year-olds with a knife held at the 9-year-old sibling's throat. We've got extreme violence, which the police are then responding to. So it's an extremely high risk situation or engagement for us as well, because we're engaging in use of force in a way that no one wants to be doing that. Inherently, we would know instinctively as people that that's not the right thing to do. And that then sets a trajectory about what the rest of the relationship's going to look like thereafter with the criminal justice system, because we've started on a very, very poor footing. So coming in at the crisis end, that's a real disadvantage for us. The options of our outputs, the application of police discretion is fine if we can have strategies to manage risk. We can apply discretion. We can move through with cautions or diversionary processes. But if we fundamentally don't have a way of managing that risk because we have no respite for the young person to go to, we have no trusted adult that they're engaging with, they're not actually connected with school, which gives them a circuit breaker. If none of those other protective factors are there, then we're funneled into a very narrow response, because we have to still have that primary focus around maintaining safety. And that then means that we do start labelling and targeting the young person, and they're heading not in the protective stream of the children's court, they're heading in the criminal justice stream.
Thanks so much, Donna. And this highlights the challenge. I think we're going to come back to some of the, what would a different response or an improved response actually look like. So for those in the audience who are asking questions along those lines, that's something that we definitely like to be told that I'm quiet, and that's because one of my, is that better? Hopefully that's better. Sorry, the wrong thing came out of my ear. Now moving on to Steph, when Dan was talking about that funneling children towards that family violence response, can you tell us what that looks like when families actually get to court? What do families tell you about that experience, and what would have, whether it's valuable to them or not?
Yeah, I think meeting with families when children are being brought before the court as respondents to intervention order applications is a really difficult time. Often the family comes together to court, and in recent times is appearing in court via video link together. The young people are often supported by the family members that are being affected by their use of violence. And the family feels very much under the microscope of the court. Young people often report feeling extremely embarrassed and are anxious in presenting before the court. And often, as everyone else has mentioned, it's often their first encounter with the justice system. The family dynamics are then scrutinised in open court in a very public environment, which just further adds to the shame of that young person and their family. think other difficulties that parents face is they often feel quite powerless in the legal context. Parents are expecting help and support for their child, often when they're calling police for a mental health response, and all of a sudden the legal system response takes over. And these families and young people are not necessarily getting linked into the services that they're desperately asking for. And parents are, often expressing guilt and regret for having made that phone call and then won't go on to seek help in the future because the legal system has taken the course out of their hands. From a practice perspective, it's really challenging meeting as a lawyer to be meeting with a young person at that point of crisis. Often we only have 10 lines in an intervention order application, and it's really difficult to get a true picture of what might be going on for that young person. And often sometimes the way that those applications are written can cause distress to the young people, as they often don't necessarily view themselves in that way. And at times they're also being accused of the very things that they've been victims of in the past. And this can be really re-traumatizing and triggering for them. In a short amount of time, and often on the day of court, you're needing to build trust enough for a young person to, disclose the most kind of personal details about their lives in order to best understand what support they might need, as also whether they can even understand an intervention order and the conditions that are applied for. And I think, as everyone has kind of mentioned before, and yourself, Elena, at the beginning, the consequences of the legal system is that it is a blunt tool in family violence matters against children. The same legal framework that's used for adult perpetrators is applied to children. Often young people don't have the capacity to understand an intervention order or the conditions and the consequences for breaching the intervention order can lead to further criminalisation of these children. Many of the young people have diagnoses or have experienced trauma, and expecting them to regulate their behaviour to the extent required by the conditions of an intervention order is often really difficult. And although the aim of the Children's Court is to be a therapeutic jurisdiction in response to these young people, the legal framework which it's bound by really limits this.
Thanks, Steph. And yes, of course, as you say, the legal framework that we're operating in is a family violence legal framework, and the Family Violence Protection Act doesn't currently require there to be any consideration of the respondent's capacity, if a respondent to an intervention order, if they have the capacity to understand or comply with an order. And the interesting thing is that differs from the context of personal safety intervention orders, which is sort of cover stalking issues, and certainly from the criminal law, which at least has a presumption that kids under a certain age don't necessarily understand the nature of their behaviour. And yet we're seeing kids under 14 having intervention order applications brought against them, and that includes a significant proportion of kids with a range of learning delays or cognitive impairments. As the PIPA research found out, about 25% of the Victorian sample that we looked at, kids had some sort of cognitive impairment, which would further affect their ability to understand or comply. But look, we're going to talk about what would make a difference now. And in the course of that, I'm going to be seeing if I can address some of the issues that have been asked by people in the audience. Gemma, I'm going to ask you all to think about sort of two aspects to this question. What kind of systems response, particularly if there's one thing in the systems response that would make a difference in your view, what would it be? But also, what can services do right now that would make a difference to families experiencing this issue? We've had a couple of questions come through asking about the kind of services that are available across Victoria, because Gemma described a fantastic wraparound response. That's just available through Drummond Street, but there are different agencies making different attempts. And perhaps, Gemma, you could actually address the recent funding from FSV in your answer as well.
Sure, yep. So FSV has recently funded or put some funding out through the therapeutic family violence intervention providers across the state. And as Elena said, what I've described is the model that Drummond Street is providing across the Northwest Metro area, and we also do some work down in Geelong. But I've put a link into the chat so you can find out who those local providers are, and then give them a call and find out if they are doing this work and what sort of model of practice they use, because people may be developing different models of practice. In terms of what would be the two questions that you asked, Elena, in terms of what would be an effective response or something that could change, I guess it is about this collaborative conversations that we're having as a service sector. It's about the fact that we're all starting to learn about this issue, what works, what doesn't work, what are all the different, I guess, layers of intersectionality that we need to consider with every family. Every family has their own issues that they're experiencing and dealing with in their own histories. So I really welcome these opportunities for us to have these conversations, to have our collaborative networks, to look at the research that you've done, Elena, that many of our organisations are also doing into how we develop this practice, how do we base it on evidence, how do we build that evidence and continue to learn, and how do we incorporate all of the different service system touch points for these families, because they have touch points with justice, with child protection, with AOD, with mental health, and how do we, as a all of these different sectors come together to really support families as a whole. In terms of things that organisations can do currently, I would be, reading the research, talking to the people who are working in this space, looking at how is it presenting in your service, what are the assumptions that you make, how do you unpack what's going on for those families to really understand what the needs are of each individual and each family as a unit to grapple with and deal with these issues.
Thanks so much, Gemma. And certainly there are so many different factors going on in families' lives. One of the things that's been raised by members of the audience is the family law context. And while it's something is a real issue, it's certainly something that in Victoria we don't necessarily have any influence over, but anybody who wants to lobby the federal government for to consider the impact of those family dynamics on kids' experience of family violence, but also potentially their use of family violence. It's something that we tried to highlight in relation to the recent Law Reform Commission review of the Family Law Act, but the government's not moved on those recommendations from that very comprehensive review. Danny, moving on to you, is there something that you could highlight from a systems and a service point of view, but also just quickly throwing in that opportunity about what you're seeing in terms of gender in presentations of young people, because certainly in AVIF is understood as a gendered issue, but not necessarily to the same extent as adult family violence. And one of the queries sometimes is how is girls' behaviour interpreted as opposed to boys' behaviour, but we also know that where girls have experienced significant trauma, they're the kids who are presenting to the system in crisis one way or the other. Oh. So I gave you a triple whammied question there, Danny. I was just see what you can do.
Start with the reflections, because I think it's a really interesting moment in COVID when we realised that actually the young girls were coming in angry. Young girls were coming in expressive, where usually they've been very internalised in their presentation of mental health expressions of distress. And so I think that we suddenly had this moment where they said, you have broken our trust. We do not trust. We're looking for somewhere safe. And I actually think that it was whilst it's very distressing to see these young girls behaving like this and expressing their distress, I actually think it was quite an amazing moment in time to start to see these young girls say, I'm not holding it in anymore. This isn't my shit, to be quite frank. And so, and I agree with the comment that I saw there, that I do wonder if it's easier to bring young women who are expressing their rage in through a psychiatric angle, whereas young men are either going very internal in this time in a way that they're not really sure how to express what they do or don't want to be, or if they're coming through the criminal justice system. And I suspect possibly a little bit more through our AOD system as well. So that's one reflection I have on that. I think in terms of what we certainly the aggressive young boys are still coming through. Most of them are really overlaid with a developmental diagnosis in a process. So often that is speech and language difficulties where they don't have the expressive language, they don't have the frustration tolerance. And so there's a real focus on thinking about how do we we hope there's a real focus on understanding how we hear them communicate in the way that they do. But I do believe that a lot of the immediate focus comes on how do we contain them. So if I could think about what I would like to see a change in practice that I think is beginning to happen now is how do we start to hear the language of that aggression? How do we start to understand it as telling us something rather than as something we need to fix, abate, silence, put back behind that locked door? That's a real passion for me. I think the other area that we're seeing both genders come through younger and younger is in the space of eating disorders. And again, there's some real practice changes coming there where family therapy is the gold standard of treatment, but that feeds a lot of control over to parents. So really trying to think about when someone is presenting with a condition like an eating disorder, how do we front and center their experience of being controlled and coerced rather than hand over power back to the institutional and parental forms of control that have sort of created that dynamic. And I think they're both changes that are happening in real time. I think there's a lot of conversations going on within services and between services. So one of the things that I really hope and work on is a bit like Gemma said, recognising what's our expertise. We've got an expertise in developmental assessments and understandings. We've got expertise in children and young people's mental health. But to be able to keep our care focused on those children and young people and provide a mental health response, we need to engage other parts of the system. We need to have services that are really engaged, and we're talking with adult services who are working with mum and dad. We're talking with services like Gemma's service where we can begin to understand what we can do as a whole of service when we look from all these different perspectives onto the same situation and piece together a response that we all hold rather than putting it all back on mother and child to hold largely. That's probably enough to say. I won't touch on the family court issue, although I will say that I was very excited to see that the family courts have agreed to start being trained in Safe and Together model, which is really a hope for some change in the way that children turn up in that space.
Yeah, it's huge. It was a great relief to see that announcement. But yes, Danny, that's certainly something that comes up in terms of right across the research and all our discussions that we have in terms of there's no one response that is able to address this issue because it comes from trauma, but it also creates all sorts of trauma and co-occurring issues for not just for the young person, but for the whole of the family. But we tend to place the response of the system or the focus of the system on the young person's behaviour, and then we wonder why it doesn't, what we're trying to do to the child doesn't necessarily work. And it's a challenge for all systems because we have a certain way of working, whether in the mental health space or the AOD space or a family violence space, where specialist family violence services have been designed to work with victim survivors and are now trying to work out how to work with mum who might be a victim survivor of adult intimate partner violence and also violence from her child who is also a victim survivor but using family violence as well. And those things don't sort of fit neatly into the categories that we've designed for our system. But Dharma, could you kind of highlight some of the things that you think would make a difference. And one of the questions has come through is your focus on child safety issue. Is that something would be the general understanding of police who are responding to these kinds of issues? That's obviously, you know, one of the challenges that we face as a sector.
Yeah, so I did pick up on that one, and I'm probably also going to touch on the second part of that, which is around child protection. So fundamentally, police are we learn the way we practice, and so over time, I think you'll find that the longer that members have been in policing, the more intuitively they will understand that this approach isn't quite working. So instinctively, many of them will understand that that kid, that offender, yeah, I can see the chaos at that starting point. So it's kind of, we're in the process now of giving them the intrinsic words and understanding and the social learning principles that underpin all of that. But I kind of think a lot of them would have actually recognised it. So if you think about the amount of family violence reports that you referenced earlier, say maybe 10 to 15%, there's a little bit of a research piece that potentially police have been acting with discretion, referral, support, or framing it up as a child protection issue and not even doing it as a family violence report for years, because they have recognised that complexity. Now that actually means that we're actually stepping away from opportunities of applying rigorous risk assessment. So it's not strong, but it's the best solution in a system that doesn't seem to be working for that type of complexity. And police are innovators in that way. So my role is about training, developing and informing or strengthening the practice so that it is based on rigorous risk assessment. And in that way, we make less mistakes, we let less go by. The problem comes for us in working with child protection. There's a certain threshold issue. The state becomes involved in the welfare of a child if they are at risk of serious or significant harm and the parent is not in a position to protect. So in most occasions with an adolescent using violence in the home, they actually aren't the client because they're causing the harm, but they're also still a 12-year-old child or a 13-year-old child that has some needs of their own as well. And so the parent will do their darndest to look out for them. But if there's a 5-year-old, a 4-year-old and a baby in that family, they are the clients of child protection and that 12-year-old goes. So what we're starting to move towards, and this is our part of our underpinning our reform and training process, is that we're actually leveraging the Child Information Sharing Scheme legislation to work interactively with other services and try and build care team approaches around families. Our youth workers, the youth support officers and the youth specialist officers, and the youth resource officers are pretty skilled at doing the multi-agency care team work, and for the highest risk families, we're actually able to now utilise those sort of pathways to strengthen our response around whole of families and draw in people that will know the stuff for that person, the stuff for that person, and even communicating with schools and so forth. So for us, I think that's been a game changer, and it's probably our pathway forward.
Thanks, Dharma. And Steph, what would make, because the legal response is sort of down the line, what would make the biggest difference from your perspective? And then we'll have a couple of minutes for some of the remaining questions that have come through.
Yeah, sure. I think in terms of a systems response, very similarly to what Gemma and Dagmar have already said, families are reaching out for support and having, therapeutic response earlier on is what they're asking for. But what can be made right now is that, hopefully young people can be linked in earlier to legal services and legal support so that there is more time for them to build relationships and to get the supports that they need in place as early as possible to ensure that the entire picture for that young person can be presented to the court, as well as family members also having support and legal support as early as possible to understand what that court process might look like for them, and to ensure that everyone understands what's going to happen within the court context is my thoughts about what can change now.
And I think one of the themes that has come out across the discussion is that sense of the voice of the children and young people, that in amongst all of this complexity, we're not always hearing the young person until potentially they get to the point of having a lawyer, and the lawyer's perhaps the first person that has asked them what's happening for them. So as Danny was saying in terms of pulling that out, I'm hearing what a child's behaviour actually might represent, or where it might stem from, is part of the system challenge in terms of understanding how to respond more effectively. And one of the questions that's come through is also asking, what are the early warning signs and what can families do before it gets out of control? Certainly that really links to that theme that I was sort of suggesting came out of Pippa, in terms of if we're intervening in this problem, we really are intervening 10 years too late, because this is a tipping point. This is a last resort where families present in crisis for an issue that has been building for a long time. But I suppose the challenge is that families can't do it on their own. One of the comments that was made to me in the Pippa research was that children might be removed, and then child protection or child will then start taking kids to services and appointments to address their various issues, and families will say, well, why didn't you help us do that before? It's the question of being able to identify and speak about the issue, and that's essentially where it boils down to, that families experiencing this issue have felt so much stigma, so much worry, that, as Dana was saying, that contacting the police means an admission that everything I've tried has failed, this is not working, I'm a failure as a parent. That stigma and isolation that all people experiencing family violence feel is compounded, so much more when it's a parent dealing with a child. But the point, I suppose, or our hope in continuing to highlight this issue and talk about it, is so that families understand what they're experiencing or might be going to experience if the issue, if there are a combination of factors for their child that might mean that their behaviour is becoming more and more challenging, but also that services working with those families in a range of other areas know the signs to look out for and can do the identifying for them and offer help before the point at which parents feel that they're essentially, admitting that something has gone horribly wrong and that things are out of their control. And that's the thing that we struggle with, because our responses are either so blunt, we step in and separate families and think that we've done, oh, yep, everyone's safe now, off you go into your separate corners, and we don't think about what the longer term trajectory for that, if we don't help people recover and heal, is, or we respond with a particular disciplinary lens, which is only about addressing a particular aspect rather than the things that the whole family, all a range of different support and intervention that a whole family might need. So there's a lot of work that we still need to do. I recently had a conversation with a practitioner from Queensland who wanted to know what we were doing in Victoria, because we'd done so much and that we were relatively far ahead. I said, well, we're very busy, but we haven't quite worked out actually how to do it yet. But we're working on it, and we're working on it together. So this discussion today is part of that, and we hope that by highlighting this issue for the audience today and anyone else interested that we've started or we've fueled that conversation for you to then take back to your different practice areas, your different organisations, and continue to do this work. But the key word in this is collaboration. No one area of the system or no one service holds all the answers. So the key then is to continue to discussing it and coming together to find solutions that work for a whole of families. So I want to just thank you all for joining us. And I'm sorry if we weren't able to get to everybody's questions. It's great to see a lot of interest. There always is. It's always, sometimes we raise more questions that we answer in these kind of discussion, but I just want to say thank you very, very much to Youthlaw for organising this panel and for bringing it together. And thank you very much to our panel members. Been great to have you all, and see you soon. Thank you.
Thanks, Elena.